Sunday, Epiphany, the season of light, the season of the aha, which began back on the day of Epiphany, where we hear the story of the Magi who are following the star and are transformed from the experience. We hear the story of Jesus' baptism, which is the announcement from God to him about what he is going to do, what is possible. And then finally we get the transfiguration story, where Jesus goes up on a mountain with some of his friends, and they see him as dazzling white, and they see a vision of him standing with Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets. And now I have to have a slight change to, I was going to do something else first, but I got to comment on something that just happened. I had read closely the text of the hymn, and that hymn makes the mistake that so many Christians make, and that is law and prophets fade before him, first and last and Holy Son. That was never Matthew, Mark, or Luke's intention in showing this scene on the mountaintop. Jesus is in concert with the law and prophets. He is part of what God has been doing from the beginning of time. The hope for all, never one's exclusive vision. And even Peter does this. When Peter's often maligned choice to say, let us have 3 booths for us, is not wrong because there's 3. He rightly understands that this is going together. The mistake Peter makes is he wants to remain on the mountain. He wants that to be the holy place that we can all go visit. And Jesus insists that our work happens when we come down from the mountain. And the first and most important thing in all of this is a statement. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Peter makes a mistake, but it's better that he made the mistake. The gospel writers are really clear, speaking to the late first century audience, that Jesus is simply continuing the story, not eclipsing it. All right, got that out. Because I do have another point. Promised 2 weeks ago. February is Black History Month. The Episcopal Church is committed to know and uncover its history, promote a process for truth-telling, and a commitment to transform shared leadership and to make change. 2 weeks ago, I shared some of the shameful history where the Episcopal Church has functioned as the church of the empire, defending slavery leading up to and during the Civil War, and continuing to minimize civil rights for all persons, especially people of color. So how in the world, then, have we moved to the place that we are today? Not perfect in any way, shape, or form, but a church led by presiding Bishop Michael Curry, actively increasing leadership in persons of color and women, focused on the way of love and becoming a beloved community, and even openly engaging in grace with programs like Sacred Ground. There are a number of reasons, beginning with the extraordinary work of certain individuals imploring the church towards change. Here are 3 such stories proclaimed from this pulpit today. 2 of them come from Stephanie Speller's brilliant book, The Church Cracked Open. John Jay II was the grandson of the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court and the son of a judge, both known for their opposition to slavery. John Jay II pushed the boundaries and deepened his relationships with black people. In 1834, when he was only 17 and still studying at Columbia College, Jay helped found and led the New York Young Men's Anti-Slavery Society. While other liberal-minded people argue the merits of colonization, that is, freeing black people and promptly moving them back to Africa, he firmly believed black people belonged as citizens of the nation that they had built. That stance placed him at odds with his conservative Columbia professors and classmates, many of whom were the sons of New York's cotton trading commercial families. They placed him at odds with his church. In 1839, fresh from legal studies, the 22-year-old Jay posted this word titled, quote, "Thoughts on the Duty of the Episcopal Church in Relation to Slavery," to his fellow Episcopalians. He wrote, "The Episcopal Church has not merely remained a mute and careless spectator of this great conflict of truth and justice with hypocrisy and cruelty, but our very priests and deacons may be seen ministering at the altar of slavery. Our northern clergy, with rare exceptions, whatever they may feel on the subject, rebuke it neither in public nor in private, and our periodicals, far from advancing the progress of abolition, at times oppose our societies, repeatedly defending slavery, not as incompatible with Christianity, and occasionally withholding information that could be useful to the cause of freedom." Jay flung himself into reforming the church and laboring for justice. The same year he issued his Thoughts Manifesto, he learned of the case of Alexander Crummell, a gifted young black man seeking ordination in New York. Crummell was later regarded as one of the foremost black scholars and churchmen of the century, but back in 1839 he was a member of St. Philip's Episcopal Church and an applicant to General Theological Seminary, the Episcopal training ground in New York. Though Crummell met all the criteria, the committee refused to admit him and instead offered him private instruction so that he would not appear on General's student rolls and anger its Southern supporters. Jay immediately showed up on Crummell's door, but they were strangers, Crummell later recalled. He had heard of the rude and unjust treatment I had received and came to tender his sympathy and succor. Jay went on to sound the alarm in a letter to the New York American. In it, he said the church had deliberately established a system of caste and lamented that bishops should ever side with the oppressor. In the end, Crummell attended Yale and then Cambridge University with Jay's personal financial support and friendship, and was ordained in Massachusetts. Jay also defended Crummell's sponsoring church, St. Philip's, against discrimination in the Diocese of New York. The church had been founded in 1809 and supported by Trinity Church on Wall Street, but some of that institution's leaders fought to ensure that no St. Philip's delegates were seated at diocesan convention. When Jay filed a resolution in 1845 to admit St. Philip's, 1845, a diocesan committee asserted that black people were, quote, socially degraded and improper associates with the class of persons who attend our convention, end quote. It was one thing to allow the existence of a black church, but another to allow black people to join the councils and company of the rest of the church. St. Philip's and Jay struggled for 8 years. Convention did not vote until 1853 to recognize St. Philip's and seat its delegates. Opponents seethed and spit at Jay, and he was not finished. In 1859, Jay launched an almost one-man crusade to convince the Diocese of New York to oppose the city's still robust participation in the slave trade. Episcopalians had long adjusted to the reality that their prosperity was tied to slavery, and the church would not interfere in their economic well-being. But Jay couldn't abide with such a moral compromise. The first time he submitted the anti-slavery resolution to the church convention, he was met with booing and hissing in the convention and attacks from the press. Not one person seconded the motion. Even a fellow liberal shook his head at Jay's efforts, called him a persistent friend of the Negro, who unfortunately always seemed to pick the wrong time to appear with the inevitable Negro. Next year, Jay presented a set of resolutions urging the bishop and clergy to write and preach against the illegal and immoral slave trade, and urging lay people in influential positions to do their part as well. And just as he prepared to speak, the chair allowed a motion to table the resolutions. So later in the convention, he took the floor and he laid out a fiery case, arguing why the Episcopal Church in particular was obliged to speak and act to end the slave trade. He lifted up a critique from the London Christian Observer, whose authors observed with sadness. Even the Episcopal Church then appears as quite prepared not merely to justify men stealers, to add the weight of its authority to their hideous cause. They suffered interruptions and shouts throughout his speech, but he cited the ancient African church fathers as he witnessed to the truth. He said, "Go back to far antiquity. You will have the voice of St. Simon writing to the bishops of Nubia, who both religion and humanity made it a duty for us to work for the deliverance of the captives, as Jesus Christ himself, whom we ought to consider in our captive brothers. It is him we should deliver from captivity, him who has delivered us from death." Fast forward. Paul Washington was a black priest in Philadelphia from 1954 to 1987. Few would have faulted him if he clung to the safety and privilege his education and class background provided. It would have been a triumph enough for a black man born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1921 to succeed at all. But for Washington, it was not enough. He had access to a plum position of power, but instead he crossed borders of class and privilege to join the Black Power movement, to honor poor and forgotten people, and risked his ministry to guarantee women's rights in the church. Asked why he so often landed on the margins and brought the church with him, he was known to say, "Those who are cowards will ask if it's safe. Those who are political will ask, is it expedient? Those who are vain will ask, is it popular? But those who have a conscience will ask, is it right?" The Church of the Advocate in Philadelphia was already a respected center for urban ministry when Washington arrived there in 1962. It was founded in 1900 as a middle and working class church without pew rents. Pew rents. A truly democratic move at a time where most Episcopal churches charged for pews and reserved the best spots for their most prestigious members. On the flip side, because the church was of lower class, the diocesan powers insisted that members could not elect their own rector or handle financial and administrative decisions. Instead, the bishop designated a board of wealthy outside trustees to manage the church's most important affairs. It was patronizing, but it was the only way diocesan leaders knew to do with the ministry of the less privileged communities. In the 1940s, the dwindling white congregation of the Advocate received the members of a closed black Episcopal church. And by the time Washington came on the scene, the Advocate was a relatively integrated church with members who did good works but rarely rocked the boat. Looking beyond the sprawling building, he saw a neighborhood so riddled with crime and gangs that the police commissioner had dubbed it the jungle. The bishop and the denominational level leadership took a chance and invested in the Advocate and in Washington, hoping that together they would create an example of vital Episcopal ministry in a troubled city. And Washington took that call and ran it straight into the arms of suffering people. It broke his heart, he said, when he saw poor and needy people, quote, treated like trash, blamed for being poor, dehumanized, and always kept waiting. He made up his mind early that he would not participate in this dehumanization of his struggling neighbors. Instead, he would give himself away to them. He wrote, "I decided to give myself, my soul, my time, my resources to everyone who came to see me. Every person was Christ. I instructed my family when someone rings the doorbell and asks to see me, don't come tell me and describe clean or dirty, drunk or sober, white or black. Just tell me someone's at the door to see you." That policy didn't sit well with the class-conscious teachers, doctors, city employees, or other special people who made up the bulk of the Advocate's membership. He continued preaching and teaching at the Advocate, as well as white churches across the diocese around the country, working to convince Episcopalians the church exists for just this kind of sacrificial, prophetic witness. The number of people in the Advocate's pews on Sundays declined, but the number who took part in community ministries and outreach climbed higher. And Washington took it as a sign that they were on the right track. Black leaders in Philadelphia would trust Washington more and more, even if he was an institution man. Student organizer John Churchill used the Advocate as his base for outreach to gangs. One day, he suggested the Advocate host a Black unity rally. Washington initially cringed. What business the church has stirring such controversy? In his autobiography, Washington recalls how Churchill called him out. He said, "You are Episcopalian. It's a church that represents the white section and racism in its most sophisticated but vicious fashion. You're going to have to make a choice. Fight for the liberation of our people and maybe get kicked out of this church. Or you may reach a point where you know you have to leave." Washington quietly replied, "I'm going all the way." And then he did, leveraging his relationships in the church in the city of Philadelphia. Acting as a translator, he just reached the institution in Reverend. The Advocate hosted a Black unity rally. And then when national Black leaders asked him to serve as host in 1968 for a gathering of 8,000 people focused on Black consciousness and self-determination, he did. When the Black Panthers proposed Philadelphia as the base for the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention in 1970, he signed on. Very Holy wanted to organize a peace gathering for Philadelphia's warring street gangs. He told Washington, "This is the only place where we can meet." And then, the church discerned one of their own, a brilliant white organizer named Sue Hyatt, had a calling to the priesthood. Washington said yes. Remember, women were not allowed to be ordained at this time. Knowing that it might cost him his priesthood, he acted as a supporter, a listener, a planner, and a co-strategist. He wrote, "At that time I knew only one thing. A Black priest in an Native parish had disobeyed his bishop, the presiding bishop, and the General Convention in action that was broadcast to the world. I was in trouble. This was truly the longest, the lowest, and perhaps the loneliness of my life." But he kept going. And on July 29th, 1976, the feast of Saints Mary's and Martha, Washington and the Advocate made Episcopal history by hosting the irregular priestly ordinations of a group of women known as the Philadelphia 11. 3 retired bishops performed the ordination, and the critics raged, and the church took one step closer to the reign of God. All right, last story. Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice tells the story of Pauli Murray, who worked for the Works Projects Administration as a teacher at the New York City Remedial Reading Project in the 1930s. Murray's articles and poems were published in various magazines and publications of the NAACP. Murray quickly became involved with the Civil Rights Movement. In 1938, Murray began a media and letter writing campaign to enter graduate school at the all-white University of North Carolina, which received national publicity. As a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Murray worked to end segregation on public transport. In March 1940, she was arrested and imprisoned for refusing to sit at the back of the bus in Virginia. In 1941, Murray joined George Hauser, James Farmer, and Beta Rustin to form the nonviolence-focused Congress of Racial Equality. In 1944, Pauli Murray graduated at the top of their law school class from Howard University. In the final law school paper at Howard University School of Law, Murray wrote that separate could never be equal. And that work helped shape the legal argument for the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling. It was also at Howard that Murray became acutely aware of the oppression faced as a black person perceived as a woman, coining the term Jane Crow to describe the experience. The Rosenwald Fellowship was awarded to valedictorian, and previous top graduates had used the fellowship to attend Harvard University. And despite winning that fellowship, Murray was rejected from Harvard Law School due to sexism, echoing previous rejections that Murray had experienced. Instead, Murray went to the University of California Board School of Law, receiving the Master's of Law degree. The master thesis that Murray wrote, The Right to Equal Opportunity in Employment. President John Kennedy appointed Pauli Murray to the Committee on Civil and Political Rights as part of his Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. Pauli Murray joined Betty Fryman and others to form the National Organization for Women in 1966. And from 1968 to 1973, Dr. Pauli Murray served as a faculty member of Brandeis University, teaching in our early American Studies program. In 1973, following the death of her longtime partner, Irene Barlow, Murray left the tenured position to become a candidate for ordination at General Theological Seminary. And in 1977, at the age of 66, Pauli Murray became the first black woman to become an Episcopal priest. Murray was ordained and celebrated Holy Eucharist at the same chapel from North Carolina parish where Murray's grandmother, a slave, had been baptized. It is also now known that Murray was gender nonconforming, and that Murray actually questioned her gender and sex. Murray repeatedly asked physicians for hormone therapy and exploratory surgery to investigate their reproductive organs, but was denied gender-affirming medical care, just as she would be denied here today. But it amazed me, like for justice, Murray was an advocate for women while being forced to present as a woman. And Murray is one of 5 honorees for the American Women's Quarters program that will be minted for next year. Stephanie writes, the witness of Episcopalians who resisted and remained steadfast in the way of Jesus is important to account. None of them were perfect. None were saints. Still, if there's any hope for new life in our current moment of chaos and opportunity, we may find it while listening deeply to ancestors and companions who turned away from empire, privilege, and self-centeredness, recentered their lives on Jesus, and walked towards God's beloved community. That is the Epiphany message in a nutshell. That is the point of the Transfiguration. Jesus is part of God's long, unfolding plan. And when Peter would rather sit on the mountaintop and simply honor him, Jesus says you have to go down, back to the work, back to actively making God's plan a reality. The most important words in all of this. Don't be afraid. Don't stop becoming what God hopes. Don't be afraid. Thanks be to God.